千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Dao to travel the journey together. Everyone, welcome back. We are here once again to delve into the Dao de Jing. Here is what we talked about last time, and what I've done here is that I've highlighted the middle part of it to just reiterate to everyone who heard this before, and also to inform all the people who are just coming in now that Dao De Jing, what we know as the book Dao De Jing, is actually divided into two books, Dao Jing and De Jing, with the chapters that you see there. So when we talk about chapter 38, we're actually talking about the first chapter of the second book. So De Jing is the virtue classic, and below that you'll see some notes on the correct translation of De. So De is an important concept. We'll talk about that a little more today. De is pervasive in Chinese culture and has a whole bunch of important implications, some of which include benevolence and righteousness, 仁义, and those will be our main topics today. And you will see how everything is connected together. For now, let's do a quick recap of what we were previously. And as you may recall, previously we did a sectional analysis. It's a long chapter, as you can see, 29 lines, a lot longer than the other ones. So we divided it up into two logical segments, the top half, the bottom half. And as I noted before, what we did was that we highlighted all the similar characters and then noted that the first half is all about the high and low levels of different qualities including virtue, benevolence, righteousness, and etiquette. So putting all of that together, we have the top half being about the high and low, the different levels. Then the bottom half is about something that's connected to the top half, but a little bit different. And that is what happens when you lose one level and you have to go down to the next level. So the character that repeats from line 16 down for 4 lines is the character for loss. So when the Dao is lost, you get to virtue and so on. So the bottom half, I've characterized it as following the theme of loss. What happens when the Dao is forgotten, no longer practiced? There's pervasive chaos and strife across the land. Yeah, I know, kind of describes our world right now, right? So it's important for us to talk about these things and then use the Dao as guidance to help us through these turbulent times. So to continue with the recap, what we did was that after we broke it down into two halves, we focused on each half individually. So in the first half, from line 1 to line 15, we were able to do further analysis to break it down even more. So the top half itself can be divided into two, because from line 1 to line 8, it's all about high virtue and low virtue, an important concept. We talked about it last time. We were able to get all the way down to, let's see, yes, line 8. We were able to complete our discussion of high virtue versus low virtue, what it meant, and also the correspondence with the terminology that is used in Buddhism. So that, I felt, was an interesting part of our discussion. Previously, we had, in a different chapter, different discussion, we had linked the Dao De Jing to other great works from ancient Chinese history, and there's a book called The Great Learning. We were able to make that connection. Last time, the connection that we made was between the Dao and Zen, specifically the Zen Buddhist tradition. As I noted before, Zen was actually Chan in ancient China and also in modern Mandarin, Chan. It spread far and wide, and when it went to Japan, it became Zen. Chan became Zen, but it's the same word, same character. So Chan itself was not as popular as Zen turned out to be in the West. Therefore, when we talk about Zen Buddhism, we're actually talking about Chan in China. So everyone is constantly asking questions to me in the vein of, what is the Zen and what is the Dao? How are they the same? How are they different? What is the connection between the two? Previously, I have said that, well, think of Zen as the fusion of the Dao and Buddhist teachings. That being the case, there's a lot of similarities between the two. There's a lot of connecting lines that you can draw between concepts from the two great traditions. So that's what we did last time. We were able to draw those connections. Now, that was only the first half, and just before we continue the recap of last time, let me just remind everyone that beyond lines 1 to 15, there's still lines 16 to 29, good discussions to be had there also that we will get to as soon as possible. Now, we will proceed at the pace that I believe is right for the discussion that we will be having, which is what we did last time. We used two different stories to illustrate the connection between Zen and the Dao. The first story was the Bodhidharma and the Emperor. So the Mandarin that you see at the bottom is exactly what you see in English at top. In Mandarin, it's 达摩祖师, that's Bodhidharma, Yu, and Liang Wudi, the Emperor. In the picture that you see there, it depicts Bodhidharma, the Indian monk, who was the spiritual leader of the Buddhist tradition, and later on became the founder of Zen Buddhism in China. So to the left is the Emperor and his attendants. So the story of their interactions illustrated the difference and similarities between Zen and the Dao. In the Dao, what we call virtue, real virtue, as you heard last time, in Zen, it is called merit. So at the very end of the story, I brought up this particular slide to talk about similarities between the two. So in the Dao, we talk about the difference between low virtue, 下德, and high virtue, 上德. So high virtue is the aim, it's the goal, it's the ideal. 上德, high virtue, is that which is done naturally, that which flows naturally, and therefore it is true. This is something that the emperor did not understand. So when he ordered the construction of Buddhist temples and the copying and dissemination of Buddhist sutras, he did so with the intent to accumulate merit, which is the equivalent of virtue. Therefore, Bodhidharma told him point blank that you haven't actually accumulated any merits at all, no true merits. So for those who missed the story last time, it's a recording on YouTube. Let me just inject a note on the thinking of the emperor when he encountered Bodhidharma. So the emperor was a lifelong Buddhist practitioner, so he was a bit of a fanboy when he met the Bodhidharma, who was sort of like the Pope of Buddhism, right? So he asked about all the work that he had done, and he wanted to get some kind of a evaluation from the spiritual leader, the spiritual authority that was Bodhidharma. In modern times, this would be the kind of questions like, listen, master, I've done all this work. So on a scale from 1 to 10, where would you say I scored? Right? So the Bodhidharma, in being very blunt with him, gave him the answer, well, you are at the lowest level. In fact, you are 0. You're not even on the scale. You're not even on a scale from 1 to 10. You're at 0. This was surprising because the emperor thought, well, maybe he'll say 10, which means I've done really well. Or if not that, maybe he'll say, yeah, I give you a 6 or 7. You got to work a little harder to get to a 10, right? But suddenly 0. Wow. And that's because of what you see here. Low virtue never loses virtue. Therefore, it has no virtue. That is a straight line between the Dao and the Zen. We then further our discussion with another story, and this one, the dueling palms from Huineng and Shen Xiu. These are generations after the time of Bodhidharma. About a century, more than a century after the time of Bodhidharma. So remember I said that the Bodhidharma founded the tradition of Zen Buddhism in China. This happened after his conversation with the emperor, which was a historical occurrence, historical event. It actually occurred. Bodhidharma is a historical figure. He was actually a living, breathing human being who walked the earth in ancient China about 1,000 years ago. So Bodhidharma went off and then founded the tradition of Buddhism, and he did so in Shaolin, what we know as the Shaolin Temple today. And while doing that, he also taught the monks there exercise to strengthen the body, and that's how we have Shaolin Kung Fu today. But that's another story for another time. Ever since he founded the tradition of Zen Buddhism, it's been passed down from generation to generation. He was known, Bodhidharma was known as the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism. The monk who succeeded after him was the second patriarch, and then the third, the fourth, and so on. By the time of Huineng and Shen Xiu, this particular story, it was the time of the fifth generation, the fifth patriarch. So the story that I told the last time was about this young man, Huineng, who went to study Zen Buddhism under the fifth patriarch. And while he was there in his cultivation and study, that was when the fifth patriarch said, well, look, everybody, I am ready to pass down the begging bowl and the robes of the first patriarch, the Bodhidharma. These are the symbols of authority in our tradition. I'm ready to pass it down to the sixth patriarch. Who should I give it to? Well, I'm going to give it to someone who can demonstrate true understanding. So why don't you all go off and write me a poem to demonstrate how well you understand the truth. So and this is what led to the story last time, the dueling poems. And to recap the story, which you can always see on YouTube, it's being recorded. There's two different perspectives at work where Shen Xiu expressed the idea that is associated with low virtue in a positive way. Low virtue takes contrived action and acts with agenda, as you see over here on the right. So the perspective of Zen Shou was that we got to practice, we got to keep practicing, we got to be diligent, we got to be disciplined. Nothing wrong with that. So the way he put it, the way he expressed it was strive to clean it constantly, it being the mirror that represents the human soul. Gotta keep cleaning it because there's always dust. Yeah, if you don't clean it constantly, it'll get dusty. That's the discipline. So the fifth patriarch understood what Zen Shou was getting at, but also realized that this was the path to the ultimate attainment, which was enlightenment, but it was not the ultimate attainment itself. In other words, Zen Shou, the head monk, the senior disciple, while he was excellent, truly excellent in every way, he hadn't actually gotten to that enlightened stage as of yet. Then the young man, Huinen, came in expressing high virtue. High virtue takes no contrived action and acts without agenda. This is the level, this is the realm, this is the state that is one step away from the Dao itself. So he expressed it as nothing zero initially. So the realization is that everything that we see around us, everything's impermanent, everything's transient, it comes and it goes. That is the nature of the material world. And the emptiness of the Tao is the only truth. It's the only reality. It's the true reality. So expressing that understanding connected him with the fifth patriarch, who then said, "You are the one. You shall be the sixth patriarch." So for the complete story, with all the details, you can always go to daozen.net. Right in the middle of the menu, you will see Platform Sutra. This is the sixth patriarch, Platform Sutra. That's a direct translation of the 4 characters that you see here. 六祖坛经. It's a literal rendition. 六 is Mandarin for 6. 祖 means patriarch, like a spiritual leader. 坛 is platform, and then the last character, 经 is sutra. Sutra or classic. And this is divided into 10 sub-chapters. All of these come from chapter 1 of 六祖坛经, the 6th patriarch platform sutra. This is the origin story of the 6th patriarch. You know, sort of like the origin story of Marvel Comics characters. This is how he came to be who he was. After that, it continues into chapter 2, chapter 3, which I have yet to work on in translation. One day I will. For now, though, you have the story available to you whenever you want to see it. And I do understand that many of us have some free time now to do some reading, so this may be a good time to take a look. Or to listen to the YouTube recordings, completely up to you. So this is the recap from last time. As you can see, we talked about a whole lot, and we got to line 8. Let's continue on from line 9. In line 9, we switch gears. No longer are we talking about high virtue and low virtue. We now talk about another concept called high benevolence. This is an important concept. A little below that, 2 lines below that, you're going to see high righteousness. That's another important concept that we'll cover today. But let's start with high benevolence, 上仁. High benevolence takes contrived action. Hey, contrived action, isn't that not a good thing? Well, first of all, let's get the introductory remarks out of the way, starting from line 9. we're about to get into subtle distinctions for specific kinds of virtues. So 仁, benevolence, that is a virtue. Like it's like compassion, kindness, mercy, being good, being nice. 仁, one of the main topics today. Let me talk about 仁 for just a moment. The pinyin is ren, as you see there. So as a native English speaker, you may say ren. That's how it kind of sounds from the way it's spelled. In Mandarin, it's a little bit different, ren, but it's ren, ren. That's the closest we can come to. So it's the same sound as this other character, ren, which means person or people. It's a homophone. A homophone is different characters with the same sound. So in Mandarin, there are many, many homophones. In fact, one of the ways to work with a Chinese dictionary is to flip open to the end of it where there's a whole index that's been made on all the different sounds. And then you zero in on a particular sound and you look up your character from the list of characters there that all share the same sound. They are all homophones. Now, I have heard it said from people that, well, this adds to the complexity of translation because every character can have so many different definitions and there are many characters that share the same sound, blah, blah, blah. So I want to caution everyone against listening too much to people who don't actually know Chinese, but then will say things like that to project the appearance of knowledge. That's actually one of the things that this chapter warns of. So let me point out one thing. There are homophones in all languages, not just Mandarin. So the fact that there are many homophones in Mandarin, that doesn't make it special. It doesn't really increase the complexity of translation. At the end of the day, you still need to have a native understanding of it in order to translate correctly. So if all languages have homophones, what about English? What do you think? Well, in English, there are over 400 homophones, different words that are spelled differently, have different meaning, but sound the same. So many examples. When you say, I ate lunch, okay, ate is the past tense of eat. Well, ate is a homophone for eight, the number, 6, 7, 8. Many other examples, and a lot of times in language, we use homophones to make puns, to make jokes. So one joke that comes to mind is, at the reservoir, a fish rams his head into a concrete wall. What does he say? Answer, he says, damn. That's because damn, the curse, and damn, the construction are homophones. And there's so many other homophones to talk about. We won't go through all of them. One quick example is dear, D-E-A-R. Wow, that's a word that we use frequently. Yes, my dear. Yes, dear. Dearest so-and-so. Or Dear John. What's Dear John? Well, that's a letter. And living in this culture, you know that it's a specific kind of letter. It's a breakup letter, the Dear John letter. But what if it's the homophone dear, D-E-E-R? What's a Dear John if it's D-E-E-R? Well, I don't know what that is. Maybe you have a pet deer. You've decided to call it John. I don't know. So you see, homophones are very common and not something to really weave a tale of complexity around. Let's move on. The meaning of 仁 What is it? It means benevolent, humane, kind, merciful. And as I said before, it means being nice. So how do we explore this concept of benevolence? Let's continue. Now, one question that can come to mind is that when you read this line, high benevolence takes contrived action. Okay, now we know benevolence is all about kindness, mercy, compassion, etc. So when you are merciful, when you are compassionate, when you are kind, you take contrived action? How does that work? What does that mean? That's the question that I pose here. Why does Lao Tzu say high benevolence takes contrived action? What does it mean? Well, here's what he meant. Benevolent actions are contrived in the sense that there's always a specific intention. It's a good intention, no doubt about it. The intention to be humane, the intention to be merciful, to extend kindness to others. So that's a good thing, right? So I want to make sure everyone understands that the term contrived or contrivance it's not necessarily a negative thing. It can be a positive thing. It depends on the way that it is used. Contrivance is not always negative. One can contrive to be good. In this case, it just means that when you are being kind, you contrive, you have an intent to be kind to someone, to do something good for someone else. And I'm sure you would agree with me, everybody, that in these times of such uncertainty, everybody knows what I mean, it is more important than ever for us to be kind to one another. It is more important than ever for us to practice benevolence. All right, so the other puzzle is the line that follows right after. Acts without agenda. What does that mean in the context of contrived or intentional action? Here's what it means. Let's continue. So when you are doing something kind for someone else, you don't actually have some sort of hidden agenda, because the contrived action of benevolence is done to benefit others, and that's it. Your thoughts are not about yourself. Your thoughts are exclusively about the welfare of someone else, of other people. I hope that makes sense. So one thing that I do want to point out here is that in the previous section, in lines 1 to 8, we've got high virtue, low virtue, high virtue, low virtue. Here, though, Lao Tzu does not bother with high benevolence and then low benevolence. So there's a reason for that. I want to get that out of the way. Lao Tzu does not talk about low benevolence here because it would be the same as low virtue. Actions taken with selfish motives. Like what? Well, there's some examples. So think about charitable giving. That's certainly an act of kindness, but perhaps the giving is done with a hidden agenda of projecting this positive image of, I'm a good guy, I'm a great guy, I'm a philanthropist. Perhaps it is done with the agenda of creating a tax shelter to exploit legal loopholes, maybe a money laundering operation, if you have a criminal enterprise that requires money laundering. Now, of course, these different schemes, the tax code, money laundering, these schemes did not exist in ancient China at the time of Lao Tzu. But Lao Tzu saw many other examples of seemingly good deeds that are actually not done with purely altruistic reasons. And if you look around in the world, you'll be able to see exactly the same thing. Many examples of that. Okay, let's continue. There's more of this discussion. Let's talk about high righteousness. So high righteousness, you're going to find is similar, but also different from high benevolence. Let's explore. Similar to high benevolence, high righteousness is also characterized by intentional action aimed at a particular goal. Therefore, it is also contrived. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as I mentioned. So high benevolence takes contrived action, and so does high righteousness. So for high benevolence, the intent is to extend kindness to others. With high righteousness, the intent is to extend justice to others. So that's where they are similar. So there's a bottom line. There's always a specific intention associated with high righteousness. And maybe to be fair, to be just means to be fair, righting a wrong, supporting the right cause. It may be restoration, restitution, compensation, balancing the scales of justice, meting out punishment, and so on. There's a whole variety of different intentions associated with high righteousness. I think that makes sense, right? Let's continue. Now we get to the part where it says high righteousness acts with agenda. Okay, hold on. High righteousness acts with agenda. That's different from high benevolence acting without agenda. So remember that we said high benevolence acting without agenda because when you are being kind and compassionate and benevolent, you are acting from a selfless place. Your thoughts are on the welfare of other people. And we can observe a different quality in righteousness in terms of justice. And as you guys are pointing out, justice can be seen as revenge. You want justice, quote unquote, translated to, I want vengeance. Vengeance is mine. Vengeance shall be mine, etc. When that is the case, though, it's all about you. Note the phrase, vengeance shall be mine. It's about me. Okay, let's take a look. The difference between high benevolence and high righteousness can be tricky because the distinction is subtle. High benevolence is selfless. When you're motivated by compassion, your thoughts are on the welfare of others, not yourself. But what about high righteousness? That's where we see the difference. It's not quite the same. When you wish to do what's right, it is always because you feel strongly justified in yourself. Because what is the judgment on what is right? It comes from yourself. Thus, justice may be the goal, but the self-justification becomes part of the agenda. That's the subtle distinction. So here, I want to take everyone through some illustrations on the Dao of Justice, so you can see the difference in the way that the ancient sages thought of this concept of righteousness. So first, from the Dao perspective, you see it on the left, the Dao represents natural balance, whereas you, the human being, when you act on behalf of nature, on behalf of the Dao, to enact justice, to do justice, you may be tipping the scale. Let's see how the ancient sages saw this. So the Dao is divine justice. It flows naturally. It comes from everyone sooner or later. In modern times, we may look at that and say, well, that's karma. That's the karmic mechanism. Okay, fair enough. So in this particular chapter, 38, it's talking about high righteousness. What is that? That is you, me, we, us. We take justice into our own hands and act with specific agenda. So law enforcement, the legal system, the courts, all of the things that we have set up, we're specifically intending to do that, to take justice into our own hands, as citizens of a country and act with a specific agenda. So remember, it isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. This is just the nature of it. Okay, so in the Dao De Jing, it describes divine justice as the heavenly net. It uses the metaphor of a net that catches everything to describe divine justice. And you'll see that in Dao De Jing 73, chapter 73. What it says is that the heavenly net is loose, but does not let anything slip through. It's a net. The heavenly net is something that we cannot see, but it does not let anything slip through. So what happens when you want to take justice into your own hands, perhaps not as a society or community, but as a vigilante, then you are basically trying to take the place of the net to do the catching yourself. What can happen then is that there's every possibility that you can get tangled up as a result, which is why it's important to realize vigilante, like the Batman, is actually a criminal. You might say, but Batman catches criminals. Yeah, but Batman as a vigilante is a criminal acting contrary to the law, taking the law into his own hands. It's a complex topic, everybody. But this reality that when you try to do that, you may get tangled up yourself. In order to catch criminals, you may end up doing criminal things. This is the reason why Lao Tzu always recommends minimal actions with a lighter touch, to do just enough and not one iota further. So that's one view of the Dao of Justice. So here's another one. In chapter 74, Lao Tzu uses the metaphor of the master executioner. So the master executioner, again, is very similar to karma, our concept of karma. The master executioner is that which brings an end to everything, everyone that goes against the Tao. So in other words, someone who lives by violence will likely die by violence. So the master executioner, like the heavenly net, is ever present and brings justice about. Sometimes it can manifest as a communal, a societal justice system. Now, if we try to take matters into our own hands, though, same problems occur as when we try to catch in the place of the heavenly net. What do I mean by that? Well, in that same chapter, 74, it says we can hurt ourselves when we resort to killing criminals. When we take the place of the master executioner, we can inadvertently harm ourselves. It's the paradox at the heart of capital punishment. That paradox goes like, killing is wrong. Therefore, we're going to kill you for killing, and therefore do the same wrong that you have done. What? That's the paradox. That's what Lao Tzu was pointing out. So the ideal Tao-oriented justice from the perspective of Laozi would not necessarily include capital punishment. This was a shock to me as a younger man when I first came to that realization after reading the Dao De Jing several times and fully understanding the message Laozi was trying to convey. So there's more. Laozi uses another metaphor called the Great Carpenter. So it's just a coincidence that this has similarities to Christianity, but Laozi uses that metaphor in the same chapter, chapter 74. The Great Carpenter works on the construction project known as reality. And that's because when you're a carpenter and you're working with wood, you're cutting pieces of wood down to size to make it fit reality, which is the Tao. So in order to do that, you have a whole bunch of different tools, or the Great Carpenter, the metaphysical carpenter, that is the Tao, that is karma. Now, if we human beings, not possessing the characteristics of karma or the Tao, we try to take on the tools of the Great Carpenter to cut wood ourselves, and that's a metaphor for capital punishment, then we can cut ourselves when we try to use the tools of the Great Carpenter. That's a metaphor for the bullet that you see just above that. We can hurt ourselves inadvertently when we resort to killing animals. So altogether, the bottom line is this. What we're seeing now is often the consequence of taking attached actions. So I think you have a flavor of what it means, what the Tao perspective on justice is by now. It's very karmic in flavor, as you can see, and it also advocates minimal intervention, minimal interference, but it doesn't go so far as to say do nothing whatsoever. Just taking minimal unattached actions, just enough to accomplish the goal and not one bit further. That's the Tao perspective on justice. So we are about to get into a discussion on the concept of righteousness associated with this idea of justice. It's an extended discussion, so this is a logical stopping point for us to pause right before we get into it. Now, I want to tell everyone a story from the Warring States period, 2,500 years ago, roughly at the time of Laozi, at the time when the Dao De Jing was written, a time of warfare and strife and chaos. So the name of the story is Purchasing Yi. Yi is this character that you see here. So the two characters that you see in the title, the one on the left is purchase, to buy. And then Yi, the one on the right, is the concept of righteousness. I feel it is important to tell this story because the concept of righteousness as presented in the Tao is a little bit different in flavor from the English word righteousness. Yi, the Chinese concept, is about right and wrong, as I'm going to illustrate in just a moment. This story is about a man by the name of Feng Xuan. You'll see his name, a two-character name on the right of the slide. And he lived in the Warring States period in Qi Guo, the Qi kingdom. He was poor, came from a poor background, had no real way to make a living, no real good prospects. So what he did is people with talents in his time often did was that he looked around for a patron. He looked around for a powerful lord who could retain his services. And there was one in his vicinity. And that's the name that you see on the left in the slide, Meng Changjuan. Meng Changjuan was a powerful lord who was generous. He was a duke with his own territory. Meng Changjuan had many retainers, thousands of people that he retained. These were guests of the duke with no clearly defined duties to perform. It's just that he kept them around out of generosity so that if he needed to do something, he had people to do it for them, for him. And his plans, his strategies, he would consult with the retainers among them. So at that time, the name, when people talked about Meng Changjuan, they used that as an illustration of generosity because he literally had thousands of retainers. So this young man, Feng Xuan, being poor, having no prospects, decided to go to the duke to see if he can find employment for himself. He had a friend who was already one of the guests at the mansion. So his friend recommended him to the duke, and the duke said, well, what's he good at? And his friend was very honest and said, well, he's not really good at anything. So the duke asked, so any skills, any expertise in anything? And his friend said, well, no, he's got nothing. So the duke, being very generous, still decided to give him a place to stay, give him meals, was actually quite generous. Later on, he was, he requested and received better food, a chariot that he was authorized to use, and he even got some money for his elderly mother. So he was very grateful to the duke. And his chance to repay the duke's kindness occurred one day when the duke made the announcement for everyone saying that, well, he had this remote region in his territory where people were in debt to him from years ago. It is so remote that he hadn't had the chance to send someone there to collect the debts from the people. So he wanted to get a volunteer to go out there to that remote region to collect the debts. So at this time, Feng Xuan decided to step forward to volunteer himself. So the duke said to him, well, I've been so busy, I haven't had the chance to do this myself. Would you mind traveling there as my representative, collect those loan payments on my behalf? So he agreed and accepted the task. He began to prepare for the trip. He took all the loan documents. He took guards with him. And when he was done with his preparations, he reported back to the duke. Basically, Your Grace, I'm ready. And after I collect the money on your behalf, what would you like me to do with the money? Would you like me to purchase anything to bring back to you? And the duke said, go ahead and purchase something. So as to what, the duke could not think of anything. So he said, take a look around. If you see that there's something that I need but don't have, I want you to get that for me. So Feng Xuan said, yes, my lord. So after a long trip with the guards, he arrived at the remote region. So he had the guards round up all the villagers to go over the loan documents that he had brought with him one by one. Now, the villagers were quite poor. Remember, this was during the Warring States period, a time of strife and warfare. So the villagers literally had nothing, or they had very little. Now, they knew that the payments were long overdue, so they really didn't have a choice. Now, Feng Xuan could tell that it was very difficult for them. He looked at them and he saw how anxious they were. They were so worried about repaying because most of them had very little, some had nothing. So he collected what he could. He checked against the ledger. And then he announced to all of them, all the villagers gathering around, he said, by order of the Duke, I am authorized to return the loan payments back to you, effective immediately. So he handed the money back to the people who had paid. And they were stunned. They could not believe that he was doing this. They had never seen anything like this before. Then they were even more surprised because Feng Xuan took out all the loan documents, everything, and then he set them on fire. As the documents were burning, the villagers realized that this was way beyond the Duke granting them some kind of extension, like you don't have to pay now, pay next year. No, this was completely writing off the loans. It meant, the burning documents meant that the Duke would be forgiving all of these loans completely. Everything's cleared. So they cheered. As the fire burned, they kept chanting, "Long live the Duke, long live the Duke." So sometime after that, Feng Xuan returned to the palace and reported back to the Duke. The Duke was surprised and said, hey, you're back early. Were you able to collect on all the loans? And Feng Xuan said, Your Grace, I was able to collect some of the money. So the Duke said, good. So what did you purchase from me? So Feng Xuan said, your instructions to me was to look around, to note what you were lacking, and buy what I thought you needed. And that's exactly what I did. I looked around. I saw your palace was full of treasures. You didn't really need any more treasures. You had plenty. Your stables full of strong horses. Your harem full of beautiful concubines. You don't need any more of those either. So as I looked around, Your Grace, the only thing that I saw that you really needed was righteousness. So I went ahead and purchased that for you. What? So the Duke was completely puzzled by this. He's like, well, what do you mean? I mean, he knew what meant. Meant righteousness, the right thing, doing what's right, but it's such an intangible concept, right? So he had no clue, no idea how it could be bought like some kind of commodity. This was puzzling. So Feng Xuan explained, Your Grace, you're the Lord of this remote region. So rather than to treat these people as a father would his children, you wanted to extract money from them. I saw that they struggled with poverty. So in your name, Your Grace, I falsely claimed that I acted under your orders to return the money to them. And I also burned up the loan documents. In response, they cheered and chanted, Long live the Duke. So that's how I purchased righteousness for you. Now, the Duke was not a happy camper when he heard this because he was expecting that there would be something material that was bought with the money. So now it was all said and done and he had nothing. So he was annoyed. So he waved his retainer, Feng Xuan, off and he said, okay, fine, that's all right. Okay, well, let's not talk about this anymore. Let's speak no more of this matter. Now, he would have forgotten about this except that a year later, the Duke encountered a great misfortune. So this is Qi Guo. This is the kingdom of Qi. There was always power struggle present in the royal court. So at this particular time, the palace intrigue at the royal court went badly against the duke, and it meant that he had lost the support of the king of Qi Guo. So the king indicated that he would no longer support the duke. He would take back the land that was granted to this noble, and it meant that the duke's enemies were now free to attack him. Suddenly, the duke realized that he was in danger. More than that, his entire family was in danger. They could easily be slaughtered, and it could happen very quickly. So the situation was grave. It was at this time that Fengshen stepped forward once again to volunteer. Now, the duke had no idea how to save his family and his own skin, so he was only too happy to let Fengshen take charge of the situation. And what Fengshen did was that he organized a group of trusted guards. He made the appropriate arrangements, and in secrecy, he escorted the duke and his family out of the palace, and they traveled together toward a remote region, the same region where he went to collect the debts. Fengshen sent a scout ahead to notify the villagers, let them know that they were coming. So to the duke, it was a surprising sight when they got near this remote region. The villagers had all come out. They lined the road. They greeted him. They welcomed him. Men, women, the elderly, young children, hundreds of them. They lined the path and they cheered his arrival. So as the duke moved through the welcoming crowds, he realized that he was safe, finally, because the villagers had already set up a secure place for him and his family. They would protect him by not revealing his whereabouts to anyone, especially the spies of his enemies. So after days of facing what he thought would be certain death for himself and his family, he could now finally breathe a sigh of relief. At that moment, he turned to Fengshen. He said, "Sir, this righteousness that you said you bought for me, today I finally understand. I finally see this yi with my own eyes." So that's the story about purchasing yi. Now, I want to make it very clear that despite the title of the story, this is not about buying something with money, especially something that is intangible. The real crucial heart of the story is that in order to work with the balancing mechanism of the Dao, the karma, to do positive karma, if you will, the way to do it is to do what is right. Do what is right at the right time for the right reasons, and trust in the Dao that the balancing mechanism will in turn take care of you. That's the heart of the story. And our main character, Fengshen, he had no special talent, no special skills. But I'm here to say that to practice the virtue of yi, it requires no special talents, no special skills. It is something that you can do based on what your intuitive wisdom tells you to do. So it is now time to explain this concept of yi, which is similar and yet not quite like the English word righteousness. To do that, I'm going to draw another connection to great works from Chinese history. So everyone who heard my previous presentation remembers probably the 4 books in the 5 classics. So for the Chinese, this is 四书五经. Previously, we talked about the book right in the middle, 大学, which means great learning. This time, we're going to bring forth another book, 孟子, which is the book right next to the great learning. These books are not in any particular order. It just happens to be that 孟子 is right next to great learning in this particular photo. It doesn't have to be. There's no particular sequence to it. So 孟子, you'll see the 2 characters on top of the slide as the title. Mencius is the name of 孟子. So why the different kind of translation? Well, it's because 孔子 was translated as Confucius. Confucius and Mencius, these are Latin names of these ancient sages. These names came about because when the European missionaries arrived in ancient China, the first things they learned about the traditions of ancient China were the teachings of Confucius and Mencius. Now, what the Chinese called them, 孔子, 孟子, were the basis of the translation for their names because these were ancient European missionaries. They based the translation on Latin. And that's how we got the name Confucius and Mencius. So 孟子, Mencius, actually had quite a few things to say about benevolence and righteousness. So to 孟子, these were some of the most important characteristics that a good person can cultivate. 孟子always believed that people were basically good, but he also believed that it was necessary for people to cultivate, to put in the hard work, to bring about that goodness from within. So he wrote these lines in 孟子. 人，人心也，义人路也. Let me translate that for you. So the 人 that you see here, that's the character for benevolence. 人, the homophone here, that's the character for person. 心, that is the character for heart. 也, this is a sentence ending or sentence pausing character. So together, if you were to do a very straightforward verbatim depiction, it would be 人, benevolence, human heart, period. By itself, that's not going to mean a whole lot, and I'll give you the real translation in just a moment. But for now, let me explain the second line. 义, well, there you go. That's the 义 character. That's the concept that we were just talking about in the story. I want to use Mencius to explain what 义 actually means to the ancient Chinese. So 义, righteousness. 人, that's human, that's person again. 路, that's a path or a road. 也, sentence ending character. So it's saying righteousness, comma, human road. What? What does that mean? So here's the translation. Benevolence, the heart of humans. Righteousness, the path of humans. So that's a little bit better than before, but what does that mean? And you can now get a flavor for how brief and concise the ancient sages were. They often express themselves in this manner. You know, not a whole lot of wasted words at all, just the bare minimum to convey whatever is enough to convey the meaning. So generations of students after that would have to read these lines and understand by looking through the words and discover the meaning behind them. So here's the meaning. Benevolence is the compassion that exists naturally in the heart. So all human beings are equipped with this compassion, our ability, our inclination to take care of one another. When we see someone suffering, when we see someone in pain, it is very natural for us to sympathize with that, to reach out, to see if there's some way that we can help. Completely natural. And the exercise, the optimization of that inner compassion, the expression of that, the flow of that compassion, that will be high benevolence. Make sense? Now, let's take a look at the meaning for the second line. Righteousness, the path of humans. What does that mean? Righteousness is the path of human beings that human beings intuitively know they should walk. So there's a particular path that we all intuitively know is the right way. That's the right way to go. It's the right thing to do for the right reasons. We have this intuitive grasp of what is right, the right and wrong. It needs to be brought out. It needs to be amplified through personal cultivation, but it's there. It exists in everyone, which is how most people, after learning about the world, after being taught, by parents and teachers, can bring that out, can bring out what is already within to know the difference between right and wrong. And if you ask anyone about, their parents, their teachers, how they grew up, one of the first things everyone will say is how grateful they are to have a good parent or good teacher, who taught me right from wrong. That's what this is talking about. So that, I hope, will give everyone a real good understanding and a good personal connection to the concept of righteousness. Now, it can be very difficult sometimes to distinguish between what your intuitive wisdom is telling you to what your ego self is saying. Sometimes they're all mixed up together and it's confusing and it can be hard to separate out the two. The only advice that I have for everyone is to practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the better you get at distinguishing between the whispers of wisdom to the voice of the ego. So there's no magical formula, there's guidance, there's suggestions, there's little nudges along the way that can be helpful. Ultimately, unfortunately, all of us, every single one of us, it's work on our own. We have to experience it ourselves. And then, perhaps with the help of friends, getting their input. At the end of the day, though, the final decision is still up to you to figure out. I find it very useful to ask myself this question. Am I being totally honest with myself? Am I being brutally frank with myself? When I want to do something, is it for altruistic, selfless reasons, or is there something that I'm after? Am I trying to look good to my peers? Am I trying to gain a personal advantage? I want to be brutally frank and open and honest and direct with myself. All right, so we've talked about high benevolence. We've talked about high righteousness with a story to illustrate its meaning. there's one more thing to talk about in that top half, and that is high etiquette. So I want to make sure we cover that before we bring our session to an end today. In line 13, here you see the reference to high etiquette. High etiquette takes contrived action and then upon encountering no response, uses arms to pull others. Let's start with line 13 first. So high etiquette taking contrived action sounds at this point similar to high benevolence and high righteousness. Those are all contrived actions as well. Well, what is the contrivance in high etiquette? Let's take a look. First of all, we are recognizing that this is the final level spoken of in this particular chapter, high etiquette, and it has its own characteristics. And let's see how it's connected to contrived actions. It is connected because high etiquette is all about politeness, courtesies, and protocols. It is like a mask for social interactions. Yes, when taken to an extreme, it can be about being a snob, right? Looking down at someone else because they are obviously lacking the affluent background and breeding that would inform them of the appropriate courtesies at this particular setting. Now, last time we talked about how political correctness is high etiquette taken too far. That's entirely correct. It's a modern expression. In ancient times, they did not have that particular expression, political correctness. They did, however, have expressions like hypocrisy, like being two-faced, or being fake and phony. So there's equivalent expressions in ancient times for that. But I think you guys have zeroed in on it now. It's like that. It's like someone who is all smiles, all niceness, and is able to address everyone in the most polite and ornamental terms, flattering everybody. And yet, behind that mask, who can say what is the true face? So what we also know for a fact is that in our society, in our lives, in our world, oftentimes it is the people who seem most pious, the perhaps most religious in some cases, that are also the most dogmatic, the most insistent, and the most demanding. That is to say, they are usually the ones to demand from everyone else a high standard that supposedly they themselves have attained. Let's talk about that. So their high etiquette is constantly looking to demand and require from other people, but then line 14, upon encountering no response. So let's talk about line 14 here. High etiquette can be exacting and demanding, requiring everyone to conform to a certain standard, adhere to certain rules. So what happens when people fail, quote unquote, to live up to those high standards? Well, this will frequently happen in modern times as well as ancient times because not everyone knows the rules of etiquette. Not everyone knows the proper complex behaviors in a given situation, the correct way to address someone, and so on. So it is very probable that those with high etiquette The demanding ones, the dogmatic ones, may not get the response they want or any response at all. So what happens? Well then, uses arms to pull others. Arms, let me point to the character. That's arms. It's the third character here in this line. Arms, in this case, is a metaphor for physical action. The lack of response may cause them being those with high etiquette, may cause them to be aggressive. Using arms in this context means physically trying to force others to conform to their expectations. This can escalate into violence and is far from the Tao. Okay, now that we have talked about high etiquette, we're going to bring everything together from high virtue all the way down to high etiquette and everything in between. So this is sort of like a mini summary before we get to our summary for today. Let's take a look. So far, we have encountered the following concepts. We've seen high virtue, and remember, high virtue is the state where you don't even have to think about it. Highly virtuous is the person that you are, and therefore you are just being yourself when you are highly virtuous. Therefore, that is the true virtue. Low virtue, the level down, is when you have to constantly think about it. You have to practice being virtuous in order to be virtuous, which means you're not there yet. You are not at the level of high virtue or true virtue yet. Then we have high benevolence. And from this point on, we're not going to talk about low benevolence, low righteousness, low etiquette, etc. High benevolence is the level where you are trying to be compassionate and kind, do things for other people without thinking about yourself. I think everyone remembers that, right? So continue on. We then have high righteousness. So none of these are bad things. These can all be good. They can also be taken to an extreme. High righteousness is when you do things right and do the right things for the right reasons at the right time. So as you heard from the story, that is what our main character did on behalf of the Duke. He did what was right. He knew by doing what was right, it would come back amplified as a future goodness. So he was just very relaxed to let that happen by itself. And then, sure enough, the time came when he needed that amplified returning goodness to save his Duke. So bravo, more power to him, and I hope that you can apply that in your own life. So beyond high righteousness, we descend into high etiquette. High etiquette usually seen as a good thing, but here's the deal, guys. Here's the deal, everybody. This is actually a hierarchy. It's a totem pole where near the top, it's closer to the Tao. Near the bottom, it's further away from the Tao. The order is important. The higher you go, the closer you get to the Tao ideal. So the lowest level, high etiquette, is something that typically in society we consider to be a good thing. Like, remember, we often say something in praise of someone like, he's so polite. You know, he is such a polite young man. You know, we say that all the time. People tend to put a big emphasis on etiquette. It's actually at the lowest level. That's because it can so easily be fake and phony. So now we've gone through the first half of 38, and we now see the structure. This is the same structure that will be followed in the second half of 38. We're going to see this again in a slightly different form. as we get into the loss of one level, descending to the next level. That'll be our discussion for next time. As expected, we've only managed to get through the first half today. That's good though. This chapter is a great way to bring in all kinds of connections to different parts of ancient Chinese traditions, as you have seen today with the story and with Mencius. So now we're ready to summarize what you have learned today. And remember, it can be summed up in two concepts. One is benevolence. The other one is righteousness. Let's review a little bit as to what they mean. 上仁, here's a pinyin, 上仁. It means high benevolence. And here's the takeaway. The highest form of benevolence, it means the natural compassion that flows from the heart, seeking to extend kindness to others in a selfless way. So what is the other one? The other one is high righteousness. 上义. Here's the pinyin, 上义. So the highest form of righteousness, well, what does that mean? It is the right path for human beings. So this comes from Mencius, as you saw from the great works in the ancient Chinese tradition. The right path for human beings is doing the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. That together is the highest form of righteousness. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.